Great, thank you so much, and welcome everyone to our last lecture in the FEINART Lecture Series. Today we have Erin Manning with the title Tentative Constructings, Towards a Holding in Place. So this lecture series is part of the FEINART Lecture Series, which is organized by the innovative training network FEINART, the future of European independent art spaces in a period of socially engaged art, jointly led by the universities of Wolverhampton, Zeppelin University, University of Iceland, and the University of Edinburgh, with funding from the European Union's Horizon 2020 Research and Innovation Programme, the Marie Curie Grant Agreement. And so today it's really wonderful that we have Erin Manning with us. Erin, I'm just going to read your bio out, and then I'll let you take the floor from there, and then we'll have questions at the end. So Erin Manning is Research Chair in Speculative Pragmatism, Art and Pedagogy in the Faculty of Fine Arts at Concordia University. Recent books include The Being of Relation, which is forthcoming, Out of the Clear, 2022, and For Pragmatics of the Useless, 2020. In her art practice, she works at the intersection of the three ecologies, the environmental, the conceptual, and the social, with an emphasis on the aesthetico-political. Erin, I'll hand over to you. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
It's a pleasure to be here. I hope we'll have time to talk. I'm giving a very shortened piece, so there are lots of things that are left out, but hopefully there's still enough in there for us to be in conversation. If you've not been familiarized with the work of Fernand Deligny, it's mostly because it hasn't been translated. So I've been working with Deligny's work for 20 years or more, but part of what I'm doing here is trying to make his work more known in the other languages, starting with English. And as you'll see, one of the reasons that Deligny hasn't been translated, except two pieces, is that he's pretty untranslatable. So a lot of the time I'm keeping some French. I tried, but we can talk more about it because he plays with grammar. He undoes the grammar. So you'll understand what I mean as I move through. All right. It is 1968. And Deligny has left Félix Guattari's side at La Borde to work and live with autistics in the Monoblet area of the Cévennes. He describes it as the network, le réseau, and underscores that what he is facilitating is only an attempt, in French, tentative. Over the almost 2,000 pages of writing Fernand Deligny leaves behind, the gesture of tension called forth by this attempt at living otherwise is repeated on almost every page. Be careful, it seems to say. Don't make this a method. Don't harden this into a pedagogy. Don't make it about what you already think you know. Deligny was certain there could be another way. But for this to do its work, it had to keep moving, inventing itself, changing. Working with autistics, creating conditions for the living alongside, was not about reifying a type of neurology, sedimenting it. Nor was it about making any assumption about education, about where learning happens. Decades before the neurodiversity movement, Deligny commits to modes of living and learning that are differential. Any notion of cure is rejected, and with it, any idea of the therapeutic. In this way, normopathy is stridently kept at bay. In Monoblet, Deligny organizes pairings between the locals and the autistics who are sent there during summer holidays from the institutions that otherwise house them. Collaborators, educators, filmmakers, friends, lovers, participate over long periods, sometimes years or even decades. The first tracings come out of frustration, how to connect to autistic modes of existence, without reducing them to a pathological framing. How to move beyond quote-unquote behavior as the matrix of deviation, still so much in vogue today in therapeutic circles. A pencil in hand, moved by and with the child's movement, the first tracings appear. The desire to follow a trajectory is muted by an interest in legends appear, the horizontal and the vertical for different activities, different tendencies. But very soon, what is most interesting about the tracings is not what they mean or what they show. It is what they do in palimpsest, how they reactivate the inact. As they evolve, a few constraints are set in place. Quote, avoid the outline. Proceed by rubbings from the inside of an object toward the contours. The trace of the gesture or of a reality in movement, its reigning, tracings, seems easy to provoke, which would give us the beginning of a right. Deligny again. It seems probably that we are moving toward a language knotted of signs of activity. And again, it is very possible that the tracings are not at all a recreation of objects, but made palpable and put into sign a whole other matter, materiality. End quote. The network. Autistics follow locals during their farm work. The locals cautioned not to give in to any therapeutic tendencies. Encampments are made and taken down. A daily routine sets in that involves bread making, fire tending, water hauling, dishwashing. There are goats and many other animals. They are cared for by all. The work is distributed. Films are made, books are written, tracings layer in palimpsest. Sometimes they are made in the moment, sometimes later. Their aim is not to know from the outside in. They exist to unknow the very idea of inside. To move away from interiority, a shift in language becomes necessary. In the descriptions of the tracings and the writings around autism, Deligny refuses the reflexive pronoun se, self, opting for the demonstrative se. So the first was se, the second is ce, and the second one ce. Se means this, that, it. So he opts to replace se, se, always with se, ce. So you can imagine the translation challenge. He also prefers the infinitive over the conjugated, to trace, not he traced. Using se, ce, the impersonal, indefinite pronoun, alongside a refusal of verb conjugation, language finds itself moved by activity, by movement itself. Quote, milieu is language, or is Deligny. All the citations will be by Deligny unless I say otherwise. The infinitive in the lead, language not bound in its movement to a subject, the sentence performs a strange resituating of experience. The demonstrative not only replaces the habit of putting the self, se, se, at the center of all action, the infinitive shifts the relationship to time, gathering in the activity into the act itself. Deligny, tracing, transcribing, has become for us a practice that leads us toward a search for a certain us that I tell myself is without doubt not of the same nature as that which is conferred by the inveterate usage of the verb. This is what is learned in the tracing. The tracings were never about describing an environment or situating a child within it. The tracings traced as much an absence as a quote, to see which dérive intervened in our ways of being, our slightest gestures. Deligny. In the move from me to it, from my movement to this movement, or this movement moving, something else begins to feel itself into traceability. This is not out, it is rubbing, carrying across. The tracings are called maps, but they are not maps of something. They are mappings. Vectoring through bearings themselves in movement, they resonate with movement. They are not self-directed, self-centered. What they move is not a subject. Deligny is certain. When we lead with self, when we put ourselves in the center of the action, this is muted. What we need to learn to do is to mutate into the this, and to feel the capaciousness of a mode of existence that carries its movement within it, that becomes movement. It hitting, it laughing, or this swaying, this hitting, this laughing. It's untranslatable. But it doesn't read easily in French either. Se mordre, se rire, ce. In the mapping, what we are left with is the uneasy countercurrent of two modes at once, a movement and an act, both without a subject. Quote, the attempt, la tentative, is a procedure. It is not the application of principles, a mode of relation outside function. An attempt is not form. Outside function, a pragmatics of the useless, not beyond valuation, but outside captures web, mirages. The raft, radeau, becomes the figure for the transversality of this strange grammar that elides subject and object, that conjoins body and world in movement worldings, raft as the tentative structure that must remain unstructured, enough to both let water through and to float. Quote, a raft, you know how it's made. There are tree trunks joined quite loosely so that when mountains of water hit, the water passes through the gaps of the trunks. This is how the raft is not a life raft, end quote. The tracings echo a process and are a process in themselves. They are at once archives of a day and anarchives of a process. They are neither quite of the past or of the future, but they are also not quite now. They make time, making space for a time adjacent. Through them, an environment is relived otherwise, but also, in the drawing, the world draws itself into act. At the crux of the co-composition of movement tendencies that person, an errant language emerges, language errs. Quote, to escape from the order of the said. Quote, all is not said. The everyday is traversed by impersonal forces that course through its ecologies. Attention is not reduced to a focal point toward the child, toward their behavior, toward the task. Attention dances in the acrossness of what thickens in palimpsest, what paths its way into. What Deligny calls the common body is not a series of persons, but a collective agitation of the field. Irreducible to the one, it is activator of potential modalities of sense and sensation. This is what autism does in this way. Autism is rarely mentioned in Deligny's writings. It is not what is most interesting. What moves the writing is not pathology, but the way and the opening this way proposes. From the direct perception of movement moving energized through the maps, a mode of encounter with ecologies of surround is practiced. The aim is not to create a new category of experience, to segregate forms of experience, but to emphasize what is lost in neurotypical forms of looking. Because what is at stake here is never a cure, never a quote-unquote rehabilitation. There is no desire to rehabilitate what gives life. Deligny longs to learn other ways of engaging the ecologies that compose us and to find ways of archiving them. Archiving recognizes that the archive is not bounded. that across the living in the act, seeds of process abound that cannot be fully. The archiving catches the residue in overlap and moves with this excess. The relay the tracing fosters is never reducible to that one day or that one quality of what is caught in the act is the texture of potential of existence mode. The anarchive of the trace fosters the reuptake of its potential. Its aim is not to replicate, to gather into focus one way, one. Potential of existence must remain impersonal. Not impersonal in the sense of not personal. Impersonal in the sense of gathering velocity from edges that have not consolidated into form. Impersonal in the sense of movement moving, in the sense of in calibration beyond the pathology of the person. Because the person will only ever lead back to the institution, back to where personing is policed. Me does not activate the map's trace, does not. Sorry about that. I'm back. Okay. It has to do, it has to do at any given moment in a very real site, in a conjuncture that couldn't be more concrete with taking a position. It has never been possible for me to take it for more than 2 or 3 years. So I'm citing Deligny here. It was identified every time, invested, and I managed as I could without weapons and without baggage and always without method. Against method, in the tentativeness of the attempt, attuned to the speculative more than of the pragmatic in the act. The aim always to avoid any sense of quote unquote for them, with always and only to the extent that withness is an ecology of surround of what Arakawa and Gins describe as a tentative construction toward a holding in place. What the network attempts is to leave the mute children time, space, the order of things necessary to the landmarking. Repérage. The tracings map the intensities generated in the leaving, in the active distancing of any attempt to control, to organize. They catch their bearings only to be redirected. Intensities couple activity with all it leaves behind, all it draws into itself. A body turning onto itself over and over again is not only a body speaking, it is an ecology spinning into a sightedness. Deligny. In the way of the real, not reality, this presence brings crashing down the most staid certainties, disputing the ground itself on which we somehow feel secure. The me, the inevitable I of the speaking subject to whom language is prohibited, in return all access to the real. End quote. For Deligny, against method is always against language, and yet he writes ceaselessly, filling the margins of the drawings with his poetic, untranslatable sentences, tentatively tracing with words invented and tenses crafted to tune language to its languaging potential. In today's reorienting of what languaging can do, to borrow autistic Adam Wolfen's phrase, Deligny's commitment to hold on to mutism feels outdated and can come off as patronizing. What needs to be said is that the psychoanalytic moment in France into which Deligny inserts himself holds language as the center of symbolic meaning. This is what Deligny militates against. Sense can be produced elsewhere, a sense rich with the world of sensation. His untranslatable poetics, a poetics of relation, to quote Edouard Glissant, lives here. The aim of the tracings is not to make autistic languaging intelligible, as though it could be translated, as though it could move seamlessly into a language already crafted. It is not to make sense of neurodiversity, to create a geography of its tendencies. Deligny. The attention is not on the map itself, but on the tracing. It is the tracing that is literally under construction. Little by little, the map becomes boundless, or rather out of measure, as though we wanted to thwart the effects of closure, of sense that the frame imposes, end quote. The maps won't last. After a few years, new tentative attempts will emerge that make the mapping unnecessary. Maybe the maps at a certain point become too much themselves, too bounded, too certain of their contours to really do the work of exposing the more than we rarely know how to see. Distantism's long arm, to quote deafblind poet John Lee Clark, that hearing, seeing certainty that we know where the world is, the attempt to know in establishing shots how existence plays out, is always lurking. Neurotypicality is a powerful force, and there is no doubt that it infuses all attempts to see, feel otherwise. But what the tracings demonstrate, and what Deligny's writings make felt, is that autistic perception thwarts this at every turn. The maps are ambivalent, Deligny. Agir faire becomes the uneasy counterpoint of the network. Agir to act, faire to do. Agir faire. What kinds of activity, of inactness, will the tracings amplify? How will they counter a certain commitment to volition, to agency and intentionality? How will they challenge the normative expectation that we are the masters of our doings? How will they help us get away from the I of impulse control, from the subject-centered account of how the world is made? Subject-centered can only mean subject-limited. In a poetics of relation, the self-centeredness of I will mutates with the agencement that detour it. I can be made by the field, but only ever as an inflection of it. Subjects are produced, vectored into activity by the relational pools that co-compose them, but they don't lead. This is what maps draw out. Deligny. There is always something that should be able to escape from the conjugate, end quote. To conjugate is to situate in advance the subject of the action. I go, you went. What shifts when it's the going itself that is for what else can be felt? This is the power of the infinitive, that it refuses the quote-unquote instituted per Deligny. The ongoing critique of psychoanalysis at the heart of Deligny's practice lives here. Trace elsewhere of any instituted person. Quote, psychoanalysis is concerned with and concerned by the conjugable person, not to say conjugal, while we are made of verbs in the infinitive. And not I move, but to move. Not I trace, but to trace. What is magnetized by the maps is the force of the movement moving. The errant lines are pulled, lured into activity. To trace is not to draw, if to draw is an act of will. It is to be drawn into the active surround, into the ecology of rhythms and tendencies and attunements. To maneuver a raft, it is necessary to adapt to the movements of the current, to become current. This is what the maps draw out. The intensive nodes that appear in palimpsest, the returns, this is what Deligny calls chevêtres, the tresses of existence that are there not to hold up our houses, but to draw them out from the mobile surrounds. Because what's at stake is not the landmark, repère, as stable signs, but the mobility of sign as sense, the openness in languaging to what is beneath life. These pre-articulations shift the tone of expressibility. It's not that the autistics are mute, it's that they are languaging from modes of mapping yet to be invented. Chevêtres aren't made by us, aren't volitionally crafted as though I stood at the holding up of experience. Chevêtres, a certain concept of trust that is untranslatable, calls us into relation, folding us into the sidedness of our tentative surrounds. All movement in the infinitive evokes the idea of a possible chevêtre. To trace is a practice. It is necessary at every movement to revivify what tends to bury itself in a sight, to ensure that all of us be more attentive to what escapes the customary. We must reach the hypothesis of the chevêtre and tell ourselves that if they escape us, we conjugated persons of goodwill, it's toward the chevêtre that we seek, qu'ils nous cherchent. They seek us there where we are no longer. They do not escape the human. The human is not what we say, it is what we say about it. The human, man, we, neurotypicality is formed in language. Language here is not reducible to words. It is meaning-making. It is colonialism's weapon. It is psychoanalysis' claim that without language there is no subjectivity, no symbolic order. Everything in the tentative web is an attempt to dethrone language as master or mastery. Deligny's languaging is obsessed with deviating it, detouring it. To read him is to stumble, to turn, to return. It is not only in translation that the awkwardness is felt. This is a language of anglings, of attuning to limits where language doesn't go easily. To write with Deligny is to be in the palimpsest of languaging's tracing, to dwell in the dérive of what doesn't foreclose sense. Much has been written in the intervening years about autistic languaging, and particularly its poetics. In the beneathness of these poetics, to think with Melbag's autistic as well, lurks an asideness of meaning making, not because meaning can't be made, but because meaning as signification still holds on too emphatically to what it means to already know how to say what speaking is, what writing is. And this is perhaps a lesson for today as well. Autistics who use communication devices to speak give us many ways of understanding the potency of languaging. But the irony remains, an irony they understand wholeheartedly, that it is only in the making meaning through writing that they are taken as fully human. And it is only through words that autistic perception is valued. Languaging, writes Wolfland, needs the senses to open leanings and dimensions that are part of the languaging and pacing's feeling ways of dancing potential. The calls for pacing man, of attracting molecules, is varying paces all the time. Having time, Adam thinks more about calls of attention languaging, the ways ceaseless variances in feelings fall. Pacing ways meaning are like lost words in the flow. The tracings rally the languaging, pacing the ecology and the richness of overlap and interweave. Lost words are moved, caught in the interstices of maps that shape not a trajectory, but amplify its very capacity to mean otherwise. This can be lost in the current emphasis on language that has come through the realization that many quote-unquote non-speaking autistics can in fact speak, given the condition. For Deligny, it was important not to return to language as the marker of value, but at times this feels regressive. After all, he held its reins. And so listening to Wolfland seems vital. I am languaging in the walking of fast and slow and leaning and dusty conditions of construction, and the ways tired calm sometimes moves is languaging actual meaning, and sometimes it partly languages other orientations that man of autism can need. What is heard in Wolfland's writing is the plea to allow for both words and what words can't convey, to understand that languaging makes way for more than words. Wolfland would no doubt agree that tracings are languaging. Languaging should never be restricted to the words that inflect it. If languaging is only understood as what makes a claim on language, or what makes its claims through language, we are right back where we started, in the trajectory, in the frame. Turning once more to the dimensionalizing force of the Cévennes, we might think of the Cévennes as languaging's medicine. The Cévennes are a living grammar, the way the field gathers itself into sense, infraconception. They are dimensionalizing sites of the encampment's incipient languaging. Without Cévennes, language is reduced to order word, to the mechanisms of meaning that keep us in our place. Because Cévennes are not only the trust that carries experience, they are its procedural architecture. And this is a concept I don't go into in depth here, it's coming from Arakawa. What the Cévennes makes palpable is that the contours of erring are just that. To be propulsed at the pace of an errant line is not to follow a path, but to be moved. Errant lines are not volitional errings. They are living traces toward other ways of encountering movements moving. We move in the moving, we, the emergent quality of the movement itself. To simply transcribe, transpose a sensation or an event, we would lose from sight the real approach of the map, which is to draw out, and thanks to these scrupulous tracings, to observe everything else than what we wanted to insert into them. This is the difference between transcribing a sensation and to trace to permit something completely other than sensation to appear. Deligny. All acts are ingatherings of tendencies too multiple to parse. The belief that we are the masters of our acts is a convenient shorthand for our failure to feel the force of those minor gestures that co-compose us. To see movement as ours, to advance perception as vectored by human consciousness, to reduce language to what signifies in denotation, these are all ways neurotypicality acts through us. In Deligny's writings, the distinction between the in-act, agir, and the doing turns our attention to this habit of centering ourselves, and in the centering, valuing the volitional doing, faire. Because when doing is foregrounded over the in-act, trajectories harden into self-made lines that carry only the predispositions we have already attributed to them. The detour is mode of the in-act. What Deligny notices is that in the autistic movement, there is a quality, or in autistic movement, there is a quality that simply cannot be measured by a doing, as though it were carried by an already encapsulated goal, let alone a body preconstituted. Quote, the movements of the in-act do not arise from a focal point that would be there if we could say that Cyril goes to clean his hands, to get rid of the paste that is a bit sticky, that chafes. What he does, begins to do, what appears to us if we watch him from our window. However, this cleaning of the hand is enacted as though something was brewing, comme si il y allait de quelque chose. This mode of the in-act is constant amongst autistic children who treat their hands as though they were tools that they found there, that they find again and again. The bodying of the in-act is made by the event of hand-washing. Nothing is simply instrumental. Quote, it is necessary to know that in making a gesture that signs, we deprive ourselves, this ourselves, the autistic child in us, of those gestures that would be of the in and not of doing, be it only a sign. But we well see that to create them, these gestures, we would have to be sensitive to another gravity, to submit to its influence. Deligny. The web of relations is pulled into shape by the movements of the everyday. No activities are pre-planned, but the everyday carries with it certain predictable trajectories. Quote, each displacement has a goal, each gesture is important, each site has its landmarks, repère. Repère, everything that for autistic children becomes something else than a thing. The river, for instance, or some object that is no longer where they expected. Emergent attunements are activated in the intervals. This is what the tracings make felt. The weave of the network depends on these habitual returns and on the way the return. When there is movement of the field, quote, some object that is no longer where they expected, end quote, the choreography shifts, and in the shift, the weft is rewoven. The aim is neither to know in advance, nor for there to be a performance of pure process. Life is lived, the everyday neither glorified nor debased. This is perhaps what is most generative about the network, that it doesn't claim to do much, to be much. The question of how to make a day and how to attune to what else makes it is paramount, and it is studied. The pragmatic is tended, and the speculative is attuned to. All of this not in the mode of the interpersonal, quote. The network tends to something else than the maintenance of a communication, end quote. Beyond interpretation, beyond method, quote. In the tending and not the listening, beside, not behind, tending, not interpreting, end quote. Tending here is always in the modality of the impersonal. There is no desire to meet the other, no other to be met. Care is in the event, of the event. How the ecology supports the practices is far more important than singling out individual behaviors, than pathologizing the one. But beware, Deligny warns, of the, quote, praise of the ineffable. Idealizing the unspeakable, segregating autistic perception by making the mutism the object of study, would be to make use of the very normative framework that silenced autistics in the first place. It takes time to attune to the qualities of relation as they unfold across the network. A person cannot simply arrive and start. It is clear that the children are not objects of speech, that time is necessary to free the seen from the heard, that it is not to everyone's taste to realize that simple trajectories, scrupulously transcribed, reveal that the self is not the only pole, that there is something else that persists as a precursor, but on the horizon, that it is not only a question of getting along, that we are not trying to submit to consensus, that 1 ounce of an opportune slightest gesture weighs more than a heap of ideas. To get along, to hear oneself with others is interpersonality, self-other in mediation. Submit to consensus, takes a path already taken. The network resists this, and this is what the tracings show, that there are modes of conviviality that cannot be reduced to the 1-2, that intensive nodes populate our ecologies that are not reducible to us, to we. Need there be an in common, commun? We presupposes an in common, a recognition of oneself in the other. The web of relations fostered by the encampments at Monoblet refuse this tendency. But to learn to cleave away from the agency, volition, intentionality triad, enabling constraints must be set in place. Rituals have to be tended to that orchestrate a certain cadence. Making the bread, washing the dishes, feeding the goats, fixing a fence. These are absolutely necessary. Because it is only through the quality of the pragmatic that the elseness of what the ecology carries can be experimented. To leave too much wide open creates anxiety. It's difficult to find one's way if there isn't even the semblance of a... The trick is to find a generative balance between the straighter paths of necessity and all that detour. This balancing act is also necessary for the adults. They, after all, are the ones most accustomed to bending to the dictates of neurotypicality. For them, the routine can likely become too rigid, their attention too fixated on the dishes needing to be done or the bread needing to be taken out of the oven. The tracing bridges this tendency. Quote, the transcribing of the errant lines only concerned the autistics very indirectly. It was addressed to the adults, to their capacity to see in them a common territory without subjects or language released from themselves, end quote. This was Toledo de Alvaro in Deligny. Each tracing is a raft, its rubbings, its lines, its legends, a vertical line referring to the presence of us, a horizontal line, one to all that is planned for the day, float mechanisms for navigation, Deligny. This navigation requires bearing, but it must remain without destination. There is no outcome for this work, no knowledge mobilization. An attempt in its tentativeness must remain just that, tentative. And for that to be the case, for the attempt to remain tentative, the in common must be sidestepped at all. Differences must be attended to, respected, lived. Ecologies come alive in the differencing, opening themselves up to a kind of emergent collaboration with the surround. Here, minor sociality is honed. Minor sociality is a sideways sociality, a tuning into qualities of existence that are more than human. Ecological more than personal, minor sociality draws out the lively interstices in the ecologies that come. Autistics are often said to lack social skills. This rests on a very limited presupposition that the social is condensed to human interaction. Minor sociality has the quality of peripheral vision, of a feeling with, an environmentality. It is an attuning to minor tendencies and an alignment to their imminent variation. Deligny has a horror of any notion of the in common. Quote, I never created any collectivity. Collectivity for Deligny has the scent of a togetherness, an interpersonality that smells of predisposition. The tracings likely held some of these tendencies at bay. While I see human space sprinkled with Cévennes, others see it peopled by symbols, and it is evident that Cévennes and symbols do not make good bedfellows. To expose the fissure between acting and doing is not to reify activity. In the act is not about activity as doing, about acting with a focus on making legible the usefulness of the act. Representation of the useful does not interest the network at Monoblet. In act is raft. It is at once water and tree trunk, at once passage and... The project at Monoblet does not hold on to a prescribed problematic. The in-act of the raft is what tentatively holds the event-based arrangement together. This unstable structure that can withstand the current brings metastability to any attempt to close in the geography. Quote, it is about rafts, not land. Quote, it holds together, that's enough. Quote, our relative liberty comes from this rudimentary structure, which I think those who conceived it, I mean the raft, did the best they could with the realization that they were not able to build an embarkation. Quote, the raft is a soft fortress where echoes of institutional languages go to die. This raft is a dérive planted in the course of our existences to maneuver, to avoid, to attempt to avoid the undeniable fact that we dérive from the verb, dérive, that has always carried us, but where? The tracings are rafts for other modes of living. Quote, preserve the interstices. This should be the work of the maps we trace. Quote, it is necessary that the links be sufficiently slack, but that they not let us go. A pragmatics of the useless lives in the exemplary. It asks how and is concerned with the detail. Not the raft, but how this mode of raft activates a different logic of because do not already include their answers. A pragmatics of the useless is wary of those kinds of false problems, problems set up to keep us exactly where we are. Questions lead to more practices, more navigating of the current, encountering the stuck, that autistic absolute movement that makes activation difficult. Moving with it is not so much to dislodge it as to become curious about its speeds and slownesses. This is what a stone can do, or what turning around a water hole can do. A pragmatics of the useless troubles the question of value. The useless is not to be understood as having already been devalued. Quite the contrary. The useless escapes the value's capture. Normopathy runs the world. Pathology is its mother tongue. Neurodiversity is a broad term for what detours the pathology of the one. The irony, of course, is that in the everyday, it tends to be neurodiversity that carries the pathology. We call it autism, or schizophrenia, or madness, or psychosis. In Deligny, the terminology is interchangeable. It's difficult not to take offense, not to want to clean it up. But in a sense, Deligny is not wrong. We give too much credence to the labels when what is most dangerous never seems to require a label. Neurotypicality doesn't describe itself as a pathology. Whiteness stays, and yet for anyone who is attuning, it is blind. When Deligny says that the tracing does not represent anything, the threat of normopathy is heard. Normopathy thrives on representation. Autistic perception need not represent, cannot represent, because the poetics of relation it activates in the tracing, quote, are traces of relation, were it only with water and erased paths. Quote, if the maps are necessary for us, they are not useful for us, which, truth be told, is barely tolerable, end quote. Eventually, the maps dissolve. There is no more need for them. The detour is necessary for the errant gesture. Once the gesture shifts into the register of the major, be it simply because it has recognized its use value, normopathic habits tend to take hold. Quote, this practice dried up. It started to languish the day we noticed that if we adorn the everyday with detours borrowed from errant lines, these varied detours still have to disappear, somewhat neglected, forgotten, to resume their vigor through future reunions, often due to some inadvertence. End quote. Sensing that the tracings had lost their bearing, or found them, the map stopped detouring experience, quote, which makes it clear that it is not so easy to get out of ourselves. But the web didn't stop weaving. This is the power of attempts that remain tentative. From the drying up of one technique, a different one crafts itself. In the detouring, Deligny, what might be an art that didn't leave traces, that trace being what exceeds and precedes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Erin. This was a very wonderful and very rich talk. I'm sure many people like me were taking a lot of different notes. I'd love to open up the floor quite directly to questions, and hopefully we can roll into a generative conversation from there. I'd suggest maybe if anyone wants to ask a question, you can raise your hand. The button is on the top bar and there's a little symbol of a hand. And then I'll let you respond to people as they ask questions. Karen, would you like to go first?
I don't like to go first, though, but I will. Yeah, thank you so much, Erin. This was so poetic. And I was so intrigued by the drawings that it was hard for me to follow your talk, I must say, because they are so intense, really intense. And also your voice. It has this very poetic sound, so it was really wonderful to listen to you. But now I have a very pragmatic question, because I think that some of the drawings are quite old and others are younger. And how are they related actually to the book you're referring to? Because I'm not familiar, I must say, with the work of Deligny, and therefore, yeah, for me it would be interesting to hear more about how they came about. It's maybe a stupid question from an art historian, but since it's so much about the process and about the not ending, languaging in it, which is absolutely plausible to talk about it in this way. For me, it would be interesting to know more about it.
Yeah, as far as I know, all the drawings I showed were from the same period. But you have to imagine that the drawings were always made by the adults, except in some cases, Jean-Marie, who was the autistic who lived, the project went on for 30 years, right? So Jean-Marie lived with Deligny for all of that time. And there are drawings of Jean-Marie's, and I showed one of them, the one with all the dots. That was Jean-Marie. But all of the other drawings were made by the people who were part of the project. You know, they were varied, the people. I mean, some of them were educators, some of them were filmmakers, some of them were students, some of them were partners, some of them were there the whole time for 30 years, some of them were there for shorter periods. And so the one that looked most different is the colored one. And to be honest, I am not sure. We don't have that much information about the drawings because they were palimpsests. You know, they were done on tracing paper. And what we're often seeing in the most interesting drawings, you're seeing the palimpsest, right? So the most complex drawings are maybe 30 or 40 drawings. But the challenge has been the archive, as I'm sure you can feel as an art historian, that, you know, Deligny wrote and wrote and wrote. He was known as a filmmaker. He wrote several novels. He wrote around the drawings, and then this person, Sandra Toledo de Azero, received the archive, and I have no idea why she received it. I think she was the absolute wrong person to receive it, but she was the one who received it, and she's become the owner of it in a way that has formatted in a certain way and made it difficult, particularly for autistics, to have access to it. So maybe about 15 years ago, I suggested to her that I could do some translating of some of the work, and that I would like to have it introduced and sprinkled through with autistic writing, introduced by I'm very close to people in the autistic community, so I had people I had in mind. Mel Bags for the introduction, and then DJ Savary, Tudo Mukupadai, Adam Wolf, and others. And she truly didn't believe that these folks could speak. And it was so awful. It was so violent that and she said to me, well, you can translate it, but I would like to have an introduction by Agamben or Rancière. And I just thought, I'm never going to make that possible. And so because of that, there's less access to those kinds of questions, like in what year were these drawings made and so on. It's a long answer. Sorry about that.
Yeah, thank you.
Are there any other questions in the audience?
I'm sure you have one as well. Otherwise, I would go for another question, because for me it's really intriguing how this is related to what Deleuze and Guattari established as rhizomatic thinking. So the rhizome concept. How would you answer this question? How is it related?
So Deleuze and Guattari do write about Deligny, and in Mille Plateaux they write about what they call wander lines. I've retranslated the wander lines into errant lines. I mean, I live with the translator of Deleuze and Guattari, so we had a lot of discussions about this, and it made sense at the time for Brian to translate them as wander lines. But answer your question, the rhizome in my read is deeply, deeply influenced by Édouard Glissant, Poetics of Relation. Édouard Glissant was so close to Guattari, and you know, there's every sense of the question of the Poetics of Relation being a rhizomatic question in that language in Glissant. So my sense is that, you know, in the longer paper, in the longer piece, which is the first part of my new book, The Being of Relation, I'm weaving back and forth between Édouard Glissant and Deligny, because I want to go back to Glissant's work of the errant, of the poetics of relation, and think about the errant line in those terms, and then think about normopathy in relation to whiteness. So I'm thinking about it in those terms. But of course, I never am not thinking about Glissant in his conversations with Deleuze and Guattari. And because I think that's also such a vivid and engaged environment. And, Deligny's whole, Deligny was capacitated by Félix Guattari for his process, in the sense that Guattari offered him a site in the south of France. And that's where Deligny began his work with the autistics, that he had started at La Borde with Guattari in 65, 66, 67. So I think there's no question that these things are working together, and I think that the tracings are definitely rhizomes. There's no question. And then, and should we go back to rhizomes? I mean, were we to do that? I taught it last year with Glissant and thought, gosh, we should really go back to that text. It's a very rich and complex text, and it's been simplified a lot in publication, further afterwards. Should we go back to that text? We might want to talk more about the chevet. And chevet is so untranslatable, but I think of it as the truss of a house, which sort of holds the architecture together, is nothing without the house. Like the truss is meaningless if there's no house to be held. And so the chevet has this quality of being a constraint that can only be a constraint in the movement. And I think that's what Deleuze and Guattari were at pains to say with the rhizomes that has been forgotten. People want to talk about the rhizome as some kind of free ride, but the rhizome is far more complex than that. I mean, even from the perspective of a plant, these are pretty potent underground movements, and actually impossible to eradicate in a lot of ways. So the rhizome has a real potency that I think sometimes is lost.
Thank you.
It's a process of holding space, huh? I think my mind continues to be caught on this when you were talking about witness as a tentative surround. And I was thinking very much of like the ways in which also, for instance, people like Stephanie Springay are kind of beginning to think about affective pedagogies and so on. So maybe in just a very open way, I'd love to hear a bit more about that. And also perhaps how you're approaching that, given that you also talk very much about like pedagogy being the start of where your research emerges.
Mm-hmm. I cut it from this version, but I'm thinking often with the architects Arakawa and Gins. They have a beautiful, beautiful book called The Architectural Body, and it's from them that I get this sentence, a tentative constructing toward a holding in place, which is so beautiful, isn't it? It has this quality of care, but in the event, not in the person. I think about pedagogy all the time. You're right. It's where all of my attention is always, I think. Whether it's doing art or whether I'm always thinking about what are the conditions for the event. And I'm always thinking that if you can create collectively powerful conditions, then a lot will be possible. A lot more than we ever believed could be possible. And by that I mean that we could actually learn without being so afraid of being hurt. But in order for that to happen, I think that the environment that is seeded has to be generative of a potential shared vulnerability, in the sense that the teacher has to also be learning and shifting. So I'll give you an example. I'm teaching a class this term. It's the first time I've ever taught a writing class. It's called Beneath Language. And I'm teaching it because I work almost only with folks who are neurodiverse. Many of them are artists, and they really struggle with language. And in the context of the PhD, there is still this requirement for language. And even though we're working hard all the time to deviate it and to think what else language can be, I notice that when you can't come to language easily, there's a lot of shame. So there's a sense in which there's a failure of intelligence. And I'm not speaking about people who can't speak with their mouths. I'm speaking about people who can speak, but for whom putting a sentence on a page is just really hard, for all kinds of reasons. Mostly, I think, reasons to do with parsing, so selecting out from the complexity of the world, and activation, the kind of, for different people, it's for different reasons. Somebody I was talking to yesterday was saying it's so much is going on at the same time that there's just no way of catching that sentence, but for others it could be, I work with somebody who writes sentences, but they're fully unintelligible. I understand because she's brilliant, but I can't guarantee a committee could understand these sentences. So in a wide range. So in this course, we're trying to see whether we could believe that the writing we share, and I'm only asking for 2 or 3 sentences a week, and that the writing we share could be impersonal, in the sense that it would be languaged collectively. It would come out of the collective effort to language for each other. Because my classes are always open, they tend to be big. So, there are maybe about 50 or 60 people, all the way from children, profs, and PhDs and masters, and is this always open? So, and so there's a large swath. But anyway, so yesterday we haven't done the writing yet. So next week is the first time we'll do a writing. And each week the writing has a prompt. So next week we read 1 page of Saidiya Hartman, and the prompt is description, comma, adjacent. And that's all we're doing. So description, comma, adjacent. 2 or 3 sentences. And I'll read you what I received from Adam, who I quoted before, because I think it answers your question maybe directly. So Adam Wolfand is autistic, and he doesn't speak with his mouth. He types to communicate, and if you're familiar with autism, he types to communicate with facilitation, which means that his body has to be activated. Often, usually with his mom, Estee, that means that she has her hand on his shoulder. So yesterday we read a piece on pain that Brian wrote called, I can't remember what it was called. Anyway, beautiful piece on pain. And so I wrote Adam, and I said, Adam, how is the class for you? Because right now Adam is having trouble activating, and he's having trouble with language. And Adam writes back, hi, Erin, I want to vary the question to ask if the class is autistic, and if they know about movement issues, and if the class is thinking about it. I think that I am the same as Masumi, in that I think in many directions at the same time. That always is making people confused about how I think about the makings of the worldings that are languaging the paces of relation. I have the story about a man named Freedom who needs the support of the wanting ways that are part of the ways he sees the world. And that world is dancing to the feelings of anxiety because the climate and the wars are making people uncertain. And that means that the very concept of freedom is mixed with surveillance. And that makes the freedom very unclear. And that is the reason why it is precarious. and the beings are becoming the anxious marchers of violence, and the feeling of the freedom is meeting the seeing of how autistics live, joining the man of autism's worlding. Languaging is the connection to the body and will of the world that makes the dance of the ceaseless game of trying to fit into the sameness that neurotypicality imposes. So being adjacent to both wills is the challenge and makes for a dance of agitation, but that agitation makes freedom possible because it makes us aware of each other's struggle. So I wanted to read that because I think if we think about pedagogy, a lot of the time there's a sense of, you could receive a message like that and think, oh my God, did I do something pedagogically wrong? Like, was there not enough focus on autism or neurodiversity in the class? Or, did I mention freedom? Or, but what I have learned to do is to really trust those moments and to say that Adam isn't asking me to be identitarian. He's not actually asking an identitarian question. He's asking whether the event environment of languaging carries enough autism in it to allow for the freedom that would allow for his body to be less agitated. And so then what I'll do when we start next week is I'll begin there and slowly help people not fall into this tendency, which is very rife at the moment, to self-identify, to be, because of my autism or because of my ADHD or because of, and I'm not wanting to say that people don't have those things that are attached to them in some ways, but I don't think that making those islands actually fosters the conditions for openings that I am interested in trying to create.
Thank you. I mean, it makes me think almost, or the association I have, because I'm reading more into maybe Black studies rather than, or that's the direction I'm in at the moment. It makes me think of the argument of the undercommons, which is also about a kind of subjecting or resubjecting is not the desire or even the precursor from which we can engage with each other. And so when you were mentioning also Sadiya Hartman and of course Glissant, it feels that there's like mutual ecologies of thought emerging. But yeah, I'll pause there.
I would say that tradition of Black studies that is in the thinking of sociality as excessive, as expressive, in the being of relation, it's where I return and return and return again to think this work. And then, of course, I'm also aware that Fred Moten has an autistic son and Sadiya Hartman has an autistic daughter. And so, we are surrounded by these questions, and the questions of Blackness can't be separated out, I think, from the kinds of questions that I'm asking about normopathy. And it was really Fred Moten who taught me that, who said to me at one point that Black life was always neurodiverse, and it was an extraordinary moment when I realized what that meant, And so I'm absolutely with you. I'm thinking that through that literature all the time.
And what a wonderful text that you read. It's amazing, really amazing text. Thank you for that. It mirrors so much.
I should say something too, which is that I'm very lucky, because when you have people like Adam and when you have a room full of people who are coming because they want to be there, who are not getting credit, they're already doing the work. Do you know what I mean? Like they're teaching everybody in that room that we want to be together and that we want to learn together. And so when Adam speaks in the class, or other people who don't speak with their voices, we wait, right? Because the typing is very slow, one letter at a time. And this brings magic to the room, because it means that everybody else has time to, and there's a real generosity then in the environment, where I find that what can then happen is that, you know, in the best cases, there's much less defensiveness, so we don't have to be worried that we won't be heard. And by that I mean that, for example, when I did a whole term on Glissant last year, just reading the Poetics of Relation, and I tend to be a very close reader, so I tend to teach only one text at a time. There were Black people in the room and other racialized folks, and I never forgot that. I never forgot what it might feel like to be doing this with a white-skinned person, and we talked about that. Because we have to talk about it, but we don't need to talk about it in a way that is presupposing something. We don't need to put ourselves in those postures, but I think we can say, God, it must be scary to have such a beautiful book read by someone who has privileges of whiteness, because they might kill it. They might not respect what it can do, or might not even feel what it can do, you know, and to be in that conversation allows other conversations to happen.
I think it's a super lively question at the moment, this one of, and I think you mentioned it also in your lecture, no, of like how to not return to a kind of identitarian subject position, whilst at the same time still addressing and negotiating and sometimes defending, I think, some of these, some of the ways in which difference does operate violently. But maybe, yeah, Karen, you wanted to step in.
Yeah, I don't want to monopolize here, but I really thought of a term which I would call affirmative uncertainty. And I think what is so intriguing about what you just told or just unfolded is that you're not talking about a safe space in the way how we talk about, a lot of people talk about these days, but rather becoming or developing a space where you have this affirmative uncertainty, and where you're not you might not want to just affirm your identity, but to really think that you can call everything into question about yourself and still affirm this moment, because I think there are two different ways of thinking of learning. One is this epiphanic moment, you know, this Helen Keller moment, where the world unfolds, so to say. And on the other hand, there's also this moment of learning where all the structures that helped you to think kind of fall apart, because you learn something that really calls this into question. And this is a quite hurtful moment as well, I would say. And therefore, I think you also deal with this kind of hurtful moments, but in a way that you are, that you feel it, through this specific conviviality that holds you in this moment, without being totally safe. So this is what I try to explain. I don't know whether this is clear.
I think that's very beautiful, and I collaborate with Bayo Akomolafe. I don't know if you've run into Bayo's work, a beautiful Nigerian writer and public intellectual. And Bayo always begins by saying that this can't be safe. It just can't. If we're going to learn, it can't be safe. But that doesn't mean it has to be weaponized. And so then that's the question of what conditions are in place for it not to become weaponized. I don't think we can fully guarantee that it won't be weaponized, because whiteness is pernicious and neurotypicality is so deeply ingrained. And the problem with neurotypicality in the context of the institutions in which we learn and teach, many of us, is that it is so ingrained that we don't know how to know it a lot of the time, unless we really pay attention, to our tendencies. And then the next phase of it is also complicated, because to have learned to pass as neurotypical, or to have learned the modes of neurotypicality, has given us access to a certain kind of value as a subject. And this absolutely includes racialized people. And, it could be very dangerous to give that up. Just because somebody says it's a good idea to give up neurotypicality, it might not actually be a good idea under some conditions. And so I think there has to be a real sense of holding on to the complexity and the paradoxes of that problem. And so for me, the questions of race came up in a lot of confronting environments. It wasn't easy how I entered into these conversations. I've been working with neurotypicality and neurodiversity for years, and we'd also been collaborating with some social justice groups who were Black, and we invited Stefano Harney and Fred Moten. This would have been 2014, I believe. And we fully underestimated the conflicts that would ensue between Black coalitions. Like, it was very tense and very difficult, and all of these, all of our feelings were constantly being hurt, because we all wanted to be understood as, we all wanted to be intelligible to each other, but we weren't. And it was in that moment that I thought, okay, well, if I want to really have something to say at that intersection, I better do a lot of work. And so I did spend 8 years reading in that environment, and then I wrote for Pragmatics of the Useless coming out of that. But I never think that my work is for racialized people. I think nor do I think my work is for autistics. I think of my work as being for whiteness and neurotypicality, to try to be in that conversation, and then perhaps to also help those who are interested think about how they've taken on neurotypicality in their modalities of valuing or evaluation. So I think the way you say it is really, really important. It can't be safe, because that would suggest that there would be a kind of spatial envelope that you could guarantee, and it's just not going to happen. It's just not going to happen, there are just too many layers to the complexity of neoliberalism and capitalism to think that any of us in these kinds of institutions are escaping these problems, no matter where we come from. And then there are too many tensions about what we deserve and what we are owed, those of us who are feeling overlooked, by the system because of its, momentary focus on decolonization and so on. So I think those tensions are there. And so what I would say is that the only way to do it for me is to be in the works together. And so when I said that I do close readings, the reason, like, I would read Glissant for 12 weeks is because I know that if we read Glissant that we won't get in a general conversation. So I try to do everything I can to never have a general conversation, to always be in the specificity, like how is Deligny thinking about this, or how is Glissant, or how, and then, we don't get into easy sort of comfort zones where we mobilize the conversation in perhaps superficial ways.
like a form of attending to, or close reading is a kind of tending as well, maybe. I wonder, I'm looking a little bit across at you, Karen, whether we close out here, because that was a very beautiful way to kind of both open out the import of Erin, what you're doing, and also in a way recapture or tentatively hold maybe what you'd been speaking about. Although, Mina, did you want to ask a question, or is this the last minute? No, just a hello. So thank you so much.
To just show my face and say, it was fantastic. There's a lot to think about, and I have a PhD student who is on the spectrum, and she's writing a thesis on neurodiversity, finished now. I mean, just revising. Quite different from the way you talked about it, but nonetheless, I could see things in it, and I wish she was here. She's ill, so I would have passed on this notice of this meeting for her to attend. It's absolutely amazing. So many things in it. And if I start, I will ask questions. So I had one question, which is about, when you read out Adam's piece, I was wondering whether this is also him asking for, can he trust? I mean, something about some reassurance about the place where he's entering, whether he can trust it. I sense that there was something that I'm asking of a question, of that kind. And so I wondered what you would do. I mean, this is, what would you do to reassure? Because before one even begins to speak, you have to have some reassurance that you will get a chance to utter, like whatever nonsense, whatever you want to say. And this applies across the board, I think, not just situation. So that's my question. How do you create the first moment? How do you create that environment of trust?
Yeah. My feeling is that the fast answer is no, not yet, because we're only in week 2 of the term. I don't think we have yet created the conditions that are there in that way. And a Black student and I were talking about that as well. She was saying, gosh, it's, I love being there, but it's so hard to be in a room with so many white people and thinking through Black work. And I never reassure people that it's going to be okay, because I'm not sure that it will. But I will certainly be like a tiger if I sense that there's a deviation in a direction that isn't careful. But my sense is, I mean, I'm sure you would have a lot to say, all of you, about this, but my sense is that people who are racialized and people who are visibly neurodiverse in the way that Adam is, because for sure, at least half of the class is neurodiverse because of the kinds of people who are attracted to the kinds of classes I teach. But when you're visibly organized by the world all the time, when the world is making decisions about your body all the time, I think I'll have incredible resources for that question, much more so than white people do, because white people don't have to address that question. So what I tend to do is just open the question up and try to learn from other people how they engage with this, and I always have a Zoom option, and I can always, there's a certain moment in the term where the Zoom fills up with racialized people, and I just can feel their tiredness. And I think that's fair, and so it's not a very good answer, but it's a true question, and in Adam's case, I've worked with Adam for a long, long time. So in Adam's case, I'm going to talk to him. Adam's been with me since he was 14 and he's 21 now. So we've had a long time to think this through, but Adam is now the first MA student in Canada who doesn't speak, and he's also the first student, period. Like, there's never been primary school, secondary school, undergraduate. So, and in this class, we're teaching his work. So he's in this unusual situation where he stands out as different. Everybody, respects him, but he's also the one who can't speak.
Do you know about Jason Arde?
Yes.
Most incredible.
Yes.
I mean, Jason Arde is, I don't know if others know, he didn't speak till the age of 11 and didn't
Yes.
read and write until 18. And
Yes.
37, he's a professor of education in Cambridge University. You really need to read about him. It's just incredible. Absolutely incredible. How he has traversed. I mean, I don't know him personally, but just read about him when he became a professor. And if I may just take 1 minute about something, so there is this opportunity for people. So it's connected to Jason Arden, so that's why my mind is going there. Is Oxford University Press is launching a very big project called Racism by Context. It's a part of something called Oxford Intersections, interdisciplinary series of writings, which over the course of 3 years, a lot will be produced on just racism by context. About 300, 400 articles will be produced. So I'll say to all of you, Sophie, everybody who's here, so to look out for it. I can send information about it because you wouldn't believe it, but I'm the general editor of that thing, just been appointed. So for Racism by Context. So I've got the details of all the 12 units which are there in it. It includes also arts, racism and the arts, and several others which you would find interesting. I think you might want to contribute. So I just wanted to say, and Eric, I'll write to you separately. It'd be absolutely marvelous if you do contribute to that. I'll send you. I mean, what you said is quite amazing. And if you would take our time, I know someone like you will be extremely busy and you may not have, the time to do it. But
No,
I love
it. That's a stereotypical way of thinking. I have lots of time. I try not to waste it on stupid things, and there's lots of time to do interesting.
Thank you.
I also enjoyed the non-human intelligence in the background. The cat.
She was so unhappy. She wanted me to let her out the whole time I was talking, and I was trying to telepathically tell her that I was being like another kind of human right now, and I couldn't let her out, but she was very unhappy. So anyway, I don't know that she'll ever understand, but
So maybe now is a good time for us all to let our real and also mental cats out. So I'll close this. Thank you so much, Erin. And just briefly in terms of Mina's announcement, also congrats, Mina. I'm so glad that you're editing. Karen's also asked me to mention that...
Small announcement, sorry.
Go ahead.
My second announcement. Last week I started as visiting professor in LSE. For 3 years.
Amazing. Oh, thank you for sharing that, Mina. That's so good to hear. So then one final sort of thing to announce is Karen and Melissa guest edited Journal for Cultural Management and Cultural Policy, to which several people who are currently listening along also contributed. And there is an online launch for that on Wednesday, September 27th. I've just put the link in the chat if you'd like to join that. It's launching Volume 9, Issue 1, which is on socially engaged art in a new world order. Is there anything else, Karen, that needs to be said? Or are we at this juncture good to go?
No. Thank you so much, Sophie and Erin. This was really an amazing talk. Thank you for this.
Thank you for having me. It was really a pleasure. So I hope we could stay in touch.